you.
I'm happy I follow UCR because I was already terrified with the statistics and numbers. And I have been working on the stories and I was trying to find someone to give me the transition text. So I spent this summer and actually some months, in fact the year, working on this story, and you just like tell you a little bit of it. And the story is about the making of these nations, the birth of them, how the people who led these countries when they got independent for the first time think of making them work. So this first generation of African leaders, what were their challenges, what were their ideologies and philosophies, how did all that come into practice, and what was possible, what wasn't. But maybe before we get into some of what we've been finding on those questions, I'm gonna browse a little bit of history, just in brief, so you will have a sense of where these countries come from. So like an ancient history of the continent has been dominated by some kingdomships and some chiefdoms where most society were like monoethnic with a king, and the power was not as complicated as it ended up being later after these countries got the independence like 50 years ago. But before that independence period, we had about 5 centuries, which was pretty bad, like particularly bad in many ways, both from a slave kind of trade history, where most of the manpower, people were just transported from where they could have been productive to somewhere else, and that went on for 4 centuries. So when you think about that, it must have left a significant impact on the social construct, or at least just on manpower in the continent. And then you had like something close to a century of colonial rule, where after slave trade ended, you still had these societies being at least governed, if not exploited by a colonizer in a way that doesn't very much build sustainable stability or education or social construct in the society, but it's helping build external societies, countries, and out of all that mess, some leaders emerged and they started asking for liberty and all those principles that always come after some form of mistreatment of human beings. And then you ended up with this map of the continent, where you have about 54. There are some territories that have issues, some are claimed and others, but recognized are 54 countries. One particular trait of most of these countries is they are pretty much arbitrarily drawn. They went to some conference in Berlin in 1884, and they took a map and they started drawing lines on it. And so what you have is, people are divided, like ancient tribes and kingdom just cut into half, some people here and there. But also within the one country, like you can see the big country in the middle there, Congo, by the way I'm from there, you have, multiple, basically, like hundreds, 250 in there. And it's posed a challenge to the people who, after they fought for the independence and they got them one way or another, had to govern these countries, had to bring order there to deliver services. So that is one of the consequences. Of course, if you look at it from an infrastructure point of view, you had most of the infrastructure developed for exports of resources. So really, internally, the infrastructure was not developed enough to move the services around, and even education was not intentionally given to people, the local population. Some of the colonizers, speaking of Congo again, Belgium, which had was in charge of Congo, and later Rwanda and Uganda after the First World War, Germany losing them. The Rwandan government had a policy pas d'élite, pas only for those who speak French, that's what they meant. And that is basically all these generation of African leaders inherited. And we were interested in what did they think of doing that? What were their plans? How do you, I think to any leader that would be a disastrous thing to inherit. I mean, particularly these ones. So we're just wondering along questions along those lines. This society has been running for centuries, depending on the external resources. How do you make it actually independent and have it, make its own political and economic choices? How do you design your own, economic model, for example, especially at this particular period in the 1960s and so. We all have familiar with the story of the Cold War and how it's kind of propagated not only between these two countries fighting, but all over the world, everyone proxy-related kind of dynamics, and these countries were pretty hit. And but even within that struggle, they wanted to foster some kind of model they thought is good for themselves, with all the challenges that come with it, and we were interested in how did they plan to do that. So these are not how we ended up formulating our research questions, but they inspired them. So before I actually speak about the research questions and a little bit of what we've been doing about it, which of course has taken a year now, but we're not even at the middle of it. We can see how it's a very big project. I'm gonna maybe pause a little and present our team at least once. This is the team. I have been lucky to work directly with Professor Emmanuel, who is in the back there. If you want to see him, thank you, Professor, for letting me work with you. And the other research assistant, a senior political science major at the University of Chicago. She's been very welcoming. I wish you were here. I have been helping with sources that are from French-speaking countries, which were former French-speaking colonies, because of the language. But Professor Emmanuel and Shay have been already working on this project a little before I come, and they've been juggling and helping me understand how to go about these projects, especially with English-speaking countries. Now, speaking of countries, maybe I should present the countries we've chosen, what is it why is it that we chose those countries? So the idea is to try to depict the scenario or how the story went on, like for most of the continent's countries, most of the countries in the continent after that period of independence. But for that to happen, we chose 5 countries with which we tried to understand concept and then see how similar these were in neighboring countries or so. And those are 5 that you can see, 2 former French colonies, 2 former English colonies. If I show them on a map, you can realize that almost all of them, actually 4 of them out of 5 are on this line. So you have Senegal, Guinea here, Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire in French, and Ghana. These 3 are French colonies. This one is an English colony. This region is of interest because you had most of accentuated ideas and economic models and revolutionary how am I gonna say it? So most of what was remarkable about this leader was very accentuated by the leader of these countries, but also Professor Emmanuel is very interested in this part of the region because it's his expertise, and he actually is from Ghana, just to say a little bit of himself. That has made it easy for us to study and understand these things, to access some of the resources we needed to access, including the original material we're trying to get from the countries themselves. But one country that violated the rules is this one here, which is Tanzania, also an English colony. But what made this country interesting to us is, as I mentioned here, among the leaders we were interested in, what made the country interested, you can see this leader here in this book here with the title called Socialism. Socialism was, at this period of time, an economic idea that these leaders, pretty much all of them, maybe slightly, with some exception of this one, thought is the best economic model that fits the challenges and the way you should run the African countries after colonialism. A lot of leaders accepted this idea. Unfortunately, it wasn't a fairly easy to implement, in part because it was just the closest you can get to communism, and some people, and the West was not very happy about that. So let me browse really quickly for the sake of time. We can come up with some of the narratives in the question. And these are some of the research questions we laid out. And we have been working with all the material we have to try to understand things like, what did they even think an African nation state should look like? What would work for us as an economic model? Development economics, which was pretty much actually just starting at that period with, after the Cold War, Britain institutions trying to fix countries' issues, and this also permeated after Europe permeated in some of these African countries, and we were trying to understand how would economic development benefit us as well, and trying to fight for their freedom to experiment the ideas and the ideologies they come up with. And they inherited, as I just mentioned, a fairly broken society, social construct. Pretty much everything was to build almost from scratch or from negative, whether it's educating people or just trying to make people understand that this is no more a French rule, it's our own, and we have to come up with our own ideas, trying to build infrastructure. So they had a lot of expectation to meet, and they didn't have a lot of resources. So I'm going to just present the things we've been doing, and that is basically, for the most part, been looking at textual and visual material. Most of them, we wanted them to be primary source, like government documents, like countries' archives. We were lucky to find most of these archives in the basement of the Mount Liberty. It's actually surprising they have all that material in there. So we are also interested in things that were unofficial, correspondence, for example, between one president to another, one president to some U.S. president, and things like that. Because at some point they ended up cooperating and maybe even looking for resources in the World Bank and things, and we were trying to understand how and when they end up giving up to their ideas, or at least trying to match it to the world economic order at that time. So you have correspondence which previously were classified, but now we can get them. Some of them even plotting to kill one of these leaders. It's really funny to read. Interesting. And Professor Emanuel was very much interested in trying at least to find people who have worked in that era within this government, or even outside, like in the U.S. government, that had contact with, been in touch with these leaders and have their personal testimony to see how that fits into what has been documented and what hasn't been. So he's been traveling a lot, meeting and interviewing the people he can find. We've actually been spending time Googling up just a bunch of people in the government document and just seeing who is alive, who is dead, and see if we can find him. And that was our way to collect as much information as we can and try to process it. So, as I say, the work is not yet done. So far, we have been, having a sense. We've been like figuring, or at least not really figuring, but just trying to portray how challenging this thing, because you can see from from the realities of today, and also from what you know from the Cold War or all those war dynamics, you can guess that things weren't fairly easy for any of these countries to come up. But we've been trying to see how we can accurately document it on a work of literature, and we've been working on that work, as you can see here. Hopefully, we're gonna finish this. I would say soon, because we're not yet half the work, but we look forward to finishing this and have it as a piece of literature people can read and discuss and get inspired from in trying to help this society, but also in trying to build it. So this is going to be directed both to people inside the continent and people outside who are interested in doing some work for economic development, all that these countries need moving forward. So as I said, our hope is that this work get useful, but in the meantime, we have to go through the process of reading the boring letters from officials to see if we can find material in there. Well, this is, at least for my presentation, the end of it, but I'm welcoming any questions. Thank you. Please.
So this is might be also a question for Professor Emmanuel. I was just wondering, were the leaders that you were trying to talk to and the government officials, were they receptive to talking with you, and how difficult was getting in touch with them?
Maybe Professor will answer one that I know the years that the study covers. We're looking from the late 1950s when Ghana becomes independent, and then 58, Guinea becomes independent, 1960, a lot of African countries get independent. And then this is also the period when development economics, modernization theory are all up, and there's a perception that every country can become one. We sort of begin to take our attention to the late 1970s, maybe two key developments. One is the rise of monetarist economics. This is when Milton Friedman and the rest come in, and the market becomes the most primary sort of factor for economies. And then these ideas about development economics are pushed out. I think a good sort of feature of this changing times is the election of both Margaret Thatcher and what we call the Thatcher-Reagan era of economics. And I think at that point in time, everybody sees that development economics is dead. And development then moves away from the agenda of most developing countries with a focus on poverty reduction and on conflict. So we're looking from about late 50s to about 1980s. Then we see structural adjustment programs, and then the economic landscape is very different.
My question did not touch on that, but I'm so glad I heard that. that was great. I mean, like, actually, like, reaching out to those leaders, how difficult was it to get interviews with them?
Unfortunately, many of them have passed away, and those who are available are eager to speak because they kind of are a little disappointed about where Africa is now. I went to Ghana a couple of weeks ago. Some are actually in ICU. I couldn't speak to them. I spoke to one who was 93, and he was literally carried and placed in a chair for the interview. And I was alarmed and said, "Do you want us to reschedule?" and he looked at me like, let's stop that. Because he's not sure that even if you come a couple of days later, he'll be there. And he spoke for 2 hours. So for those who are still around, I wish they had a memoir and a private paper keeping culture so that they could tell that. So some of the most important individuals do not have private papers. Also because of shifts in governments, many of them were subject to exile. So they've led scattered lives, which makes it difficult for them to have collective. So it's been both exciting and challenging.